When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to some blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
This is Supermouth Dave Drason. I'm listening to Crazy Train, the best in the world right now. Please. And if you're lucky, Supermouth will be back.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, we have back a three-peat guest for the regular show, and he is a Detroit wrestling historian. He was the last credited manager for the Sheik, a photographer known for running on the beaches of Santa Monica, shooting hoops with folks like the Big Cat Ernie Ladd. And he has gone from superstar all the way to Supermouth. But let's go ahead and welcome back Dave Burzynski, also known as Dave Drason. Dave, how the hell are you?
Wonderful. Thanks for having me back.
Of course. And the reason, well, I like to relax and have a cocktail while I do these, but the reason in particular I poured this one is why I happened to be at the food store a couple hours ago. I saw a post from Dave talking about the passing of a friend in handsome Hartford Love. So
yeah, it's quite a shame. Yeah, he's been in bad health for a number of years now. And he's a fighter, and in his last photograph with his daughter, I mean, my God, for 85 years old, man, he still looked like he can go. He looked really good.
Well, I'm going to ask the question after this, but to Mr. Love, well wishes to you and best wishes to the family as they obviously mourn his loss.
Yeah, rest in peace, my friend.
All right, so before we get going, and we're talking about Mr. Love, for those who may not have been familiar with his work style and all that kind of thing, how would you describe Handsome Hartford?
Oh God, well, first I have to go back to, back in the earlier Cobo Arena days here in Detroit when I was just a fan. And I was a young kid when the Love Brothers first came in. I think it was 1969. And they made a huge impact right away. Back then, the wrestling fans, it was the hippie era, the peace and love and everything like that. And they worked that gimmick, to the hilt. And the fans hated them, just for that, just for being, hippies in a way. And they were made a huge impact on the tag team scene here in Detroit right off the bat. And I loved them. Because my favorite tag team, back then was the Hells Angels, Ronnie and Paul Dupree or Chris Colt. And I loved them. They were heat magnets too. But when they left the territory, it's like, I wasn't really a big fan of, let's see, the Kangaroos, or they had Rocky Johnson and Ben Justice, who were the champions at the time. And then when the Love Brothers came in, they made a big impact on me. And at the time, I was a photographer and writer, writing for all the national mags. And I went up to them and asked if I could do an interview, and they happily agreed. And I wrote out this probably a 10-page questionnaire. And I handed it to them, and they mailed it back to me, and in handwritten notes, and then a photograph, thanking me and stuff. And, it made it into, I think it was Ring Wrestling or Wrestling Review magazine. So they were, favorites of mine, right off the bat. And then when I was working for George Cannon's Superstars of Wrestling in Canada, George put me in with Hartford Love as a singles. And he was one of the champions at the time. And, I just had a great time working with him. And one of the probably most notable matches I had with him, managing him, one of his other partners, because Reggie Love had retired by then, and Bruce Swayze came in and was like, the next Love brother. He was always the third Love brother. But this one time we were in a town in somewhere in Canada, Ontario, and we were working against the McGuire twins. So, 750 pounds a piece of them, and, they couldn't work, They
had the attraction, though, of what they were.
Exactly. And they did the whole gimmick, they rode into the arena, up to the ring on their little mini bikes and stuff, and they got in the ring, and, they couldn't go one, as a tag team, you always have one guy in and one guy out. Well, with them,
and they would stand on the floor
in the corner
because of their size.
They couldn't get in and out of the ropes. But Hartford and Bruce Swayze did, all the work, and they put on a great bout, and the fans were going nuts. But then they really popped when, at one point, the McGuires tossed each of them out of the ring. I got on the ring apron to complain to the referee, that, these guys were cheating and stuff. And one of the McGuire twins grabbed me by the hair, pulled me into the ring. And, the fans went nuts then. And then what they did, they had me, bounce off of them, like with their stomachs. They, one would hit me, I'd, do a couple spins, go to the next one, he'd hit me, and then they'd ping pong me back and forth. So that drew a lot of good heat. And then at one point, because we worked this out in the dressing room before, one of the McGuires says, "Hey, what we're going to do is we're going to do this, and you go down in the corner, and I'm going to sit on you." And I'm like, "You're going to what?" You're going to sit on me? And at that time, I was like, 6'2", 142 pounds, He's going to sit on me. I'm going to be a pancake. But anyway, he says, "No, you go in the corner, and I'll grab onto the ropes and just shift my weight, and it makes it look like, I'm sitting on you." And then what happened, we did that. I bounced off him, went down in the corner, and he did the thing where he was sitting on me. So I was like face down on the mat, and there was a photographer there who took a photograph shooting into the corner, and it's you see the back end of one of the McGuire guys, and me, just my head, coming off the mat with my mouth wide open, like, and it made the front page of the paper the next day. So that's, one of my highlights of working with Hartford.
Yeah, well, rest in peace, our friend. So,
did Hartford Love just die?
Yes, that's what we were just talking about. Sir.
Reggie had preceded him, his brother Reggie, right?
Yes, Reg passed away a couple years ago. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing okay. I may have to leave at about the 35-minute mark. I have more surgery next week.
Well, the reason I asked Supermouth to come back is because he is a part of a group called Throwdown Theatre. And one of their gimmicks, and I mean that in the most loving way, is they are using some of Dave's photos to come out with a trading card set. And I have, on this first 4 that came out, because I made sure I signed up for it, is the original Sheik, one of Dr. Mike's friends, Pampero Furpo, Bobo Brazil, and Dick the Bruiser. I know number 5 is going to be coming out soon. But Dave, could you tell us about Throwdown Theatre, the card set, and all that fun stuff?
Well, it's just the next evolution of our Big Time Memories show that myself and Terry Sullivan hosted for Rocks TV. And, we're on hiatus with that right now, but they're came up with this idea of Throwdown Theatre. And what it is on YouTube anyway, just a bunch of old, obscure matches that have never been seen before. And it was another part of the idea came where I found a box of old VHS tapes of, part of my career and stuff, working with the Sheik and, the Kangaroos and Malcolm Monroe. So anyway, they said, "Hey, give us the tapes and we'll, convert them for you." And that's what they, did. And what they're doing now is I did some intros, like 1-2 minute intros to the matches. And they're going to be, shown on Throwdown Theatre, and plus a whole bunch of others, like A.T. Huck came up with a bunch of videos that he had. And Bobby Rocks and Carlito Hill, they're, putting all this stuff together. And it's, we've got, I think he said right now, we've got 5,000 followers and on our Facebook page, in the thousands on YouTube and Instagram. So not only is it these videos, but we also have a store right now. It's small because we're still working on different things. But what it is besides the trading cards, we're doing T-shirts also with, a lot of my photographs from Big Time Wrestling. So we're putting, T-shirts together on the Sheik and Bobo and Dick the Bruiser and Ernie Ladd and everybody who ever worked in Big Time Wrestling over the years. So we have that. And then we also have some of my iconic photos with, I'll say one of them is Bobo Brazil and the Sheik with Joe Louis as the referee. And that's blown up, I think, 3 foot by 4 foot, something like that. It's a wall hanging. Plus, we have a couple other ideas that we did. I came up with a body press program and inserted all the names, or as many as I could, onto it. And that's also a blow-up piece. Plus, it's also the back of one of the T-shirts for Big Time Memories. So we have the T-shirts, we have the merch, we have the trading cards, and it's like just the evolution of, what we're doing, at Rocks TV.
But Yogan, what is this place? What is it that you do here? Merchandising. Merchandising? What's that? Merchandising. Come, I'll show you. Open up this door. Come, walk this way. Take a look. We put the picture's name on everything. Merchandising, merchandising, where the real money from the movie is made. Spaceballs the T-shirt. Spaceballs the coloring book. Spaceballs the lunchbox. Spaceballs the breakfast cereal. Spaceballs the flamethrower. The kids love this one.
Well, I know he's on limited time, and obviously I had to cut a little something out here, folks, surgically from an audio standpoint. But Dr. Mike Leno is with us. Mike, you've known Supermouth for many years, both being in the photography game and territory days and stuff. Do you have anything you'd like to bring up and start with, since I know you're on a limited schedule?
Oh, well, Dave was one of the originators of the WFIA, which was like a huge deal. Dave, what was that, like the first annual convention, and it went from city to city, territory to territory? Was the first one like 67, 68?
No, the organization itself was founded in 1967. Our
Okay.
first convention was in Mankato, Minnesota in 1968. And the whole thing of the WFIA came about because there was fan conventions in Detroit and Cincinnati done by a gal who had Dr. Bill Miller's fan club here in Detroit, Dawn Porter, and her assistant, Dave Alexander. They ran a couple, 3 of them that I went to as a young kid here in Detroit. Plus, I went to the one in Cincinnati in 1966, and that's where I met a guy named James Fanning, who turns out to be, he was going to turn into a wrestler. And, that was my first time to meet handsome Jimmy Valiant. So I've known Jimmy Valiant's, almost 60 years. But, the way that the fan conventions were run is that, these, their little group, or, their in crowd was voting for, who the favorite wrestler was, wrestler of the year, and all this kind of stuff. But no fans had any voice in it. So that's where Don Wilson, came up with this idea of letting the fans in on the voting and stuff, plus have a say in the organization. So that's how the WFIA was founded. 1967, we had our first convention, like I said, in Mankato, Minnesota in 1968, Pittsburgh 1969, Miami Beach 1970, and then so on and so forth all over the country.
LA was 71. And then I wish you had been there, because you left when I was put on the board in like 74 at the Atlanta one with Arizzi. And then our fan club together, we had the very last Blassie fan club. Jeff Walton had it and did it the best with Terry Broad as his VP. And Jeff had to give it up when he, began doing PR for LaBelle and the program that I would later shoot for. But you were there first. I remember how, at least I could relate to you, because you were tall and skinny then, and the photographer size I wanted to be for me to stay out of the fans' way and not get yelled at was like Apter Napolitano. You were tall, I was tall, but I wish you had been there. Like 75, Arissi and I win for that last incarnation of Blassie's fan club, and 2 years later for the one I was doing in addition to that, but on my own, was the Tolis Brothers one, and we won all the awards in 77 at Dallas WFA, where uh, our Blassie fan club in '75. Boston won all the awards there. I wanted to say a couple of things too. Well, I did not know you knew Jimmy since then, so you probably, it may be hard to recognize him underneath all those tattoos. And he's like the
Yeah.
sweetest guy in the world. He opens up, he opens up as Jonathan knows, his huge dojo barn to people, I think free of charge still, like every Sunday, maybe more days out of the week, he and Angel, which is amazing. And Dave's program, Body Press, and I got, everybody was sending me everybody's programs. But at the time in the '70s, that was almost like, well, it was a magazine, unlike our LA thing, which was just like one piece of cardboard folded in half, classically, which Jeff
Yep.
did a good job with, mostly with Theo Ehret's photos. But it was just cardboard, whereas yours was like a literal magazine, maybe not quite as big as Ring Wrestling Magazine or the Wrestling World, blah, 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 all those mags we had then. And but Dave does all of these amazing things. So I didn't know that this footage that you came across now for your latest venture, and your documentary series was amazing, and it was must view for everyone on the planet, and at least loves wrestling, etc. But I didn't know. So this is like brand new, which is cool. And I think like the ties that your Detroit, besides the fact that you spent, I don't know how long with us in LA, and I just nagged you too. You ought to do a project. You shot ringside the Coliseum, LA, which had the two greatest feuds in wrestling at the time, August of 1971, Tolos Blassie, right underneath Sheik Bobo, and then an amazing kind of stacked card. Dave, you really should do a book. You've already done books with your photos, but just that show alone, for me, seeing it live at KCOP when it happened, when Tolos threw the powder into Blassie's eyes, I think that was like the greatest angle I'd ever seen, at least up to that point. And I rate it better than Zbyszko turning on Bruno, because it was spoon fed to the fans for months on end. Blassie at the hospital acting like he was blind, and then we seen him on Regis Foreman's morning show when he's at he's at Lawrence Welk's celebrity sports golf tournament, but he's supposed to be selling that he's blind in the hospital, and he told Regis, no, I can't talk to you right now, I'm supposed to be blind.
Well, the funny thing about that whole thing is I was in there was 1973, the summer. I spent the whole summer in LA. And like you said, the Tolos Blassie feud, Tolos, Victor Rivera, that was amazing too. And that was one of Blassie's last matches there too. And the funny thing was, Blassie, he knew me. And we're in the dressing room in the bowels of, the Olympic Auditorium there. And he wanted to film his last match there with John. And it's like, he comes up to me and says, "Hey, will you film this?" And it's like, well, I'm, got my cameras and stuff, and I don't want to be filming, for you too. So I took his, camera and stuff. And I says, "I'll shoot some stuff here and there." So I took his camera out to the ring. So I'm, photographing, and I turn on his movie camera. It was a movie camera, and it's like it ran for like 2 minutes, and then it stopped. And it's like, well, heck, there ain't nothing I could do. So anyway, I went and photographed everything else, and it was great. Well, come to find out, he had a cartridge, film cartridge in there already, that only had 2 minutes left on it, but he didn't tell me that.
Wow.
And he gave me another cartridge to put in, but I didn't know it stopped. I didn't know there was 2 minutes. I thought it was like a fresh one. So Blassie maybe got 2 minutes of footage out of that whole thing.
Let me tie this. I'm going to throw this at you because I know you guys like history books, particularly Jonathan. Mark Dawson actually filmed at those. I would shoot ringside when I started shooting, but he was front row with his brother Gary. These are Richard Dawson's sons, the actor. And I'm sorry, this is the first time I've ever had to be on my cell phone doing this show because the laptop crapped out. But Mark is battling cancer like I've had with my throat, and he just sent me this book that his nanny at the time, she would be, before we could drive, she was starting to take us to KCOP every Saturday for LaBelle TV, every Wednesday for the television from the Olympic, every Saturday, well, Saturday KCOP, and every other Friday, the big shows at the Olympic and some of the other spot shows like El Monte and Bakersfield. But she bought him this book in like 1970, From Milo to Londos, by Nat Fleischer, who was affiliated obviously with Ring Boxing and Ring Wrestling magazine. The story of wrestling, pro wrestling from 2000 BC to 1936. I just got it in the mail, so I'm going to send some copies of the cover and some other stuff. I've never seen this book before, and his nanny was like a former burlesque star in the UK back in the day, and then Richard brought her out to take care of the kids when he won custody from the Marilyn Monroe of England, Diana Dors. It was like the first time ever in the UK or Europe that a husband got custody of the kids. But she came over to visit and stuff. But this book is like insane. It has photos of Gotch and Hackenschmidt and Farmer Burns I'm looking at right now and all this stuff. I've never even seen this thing, From Londos to Milo to Londos. So,
hey, Mike, did I send you the trading cards also?
Yeah, I got the first set, and I was just going to say,
Okay.
because you, of course, were in the office. I knew Sheik for a number of years and treasured all that stuff. And then I should send you. I don't think I might have sent you and the ring announcer. Why is his name escaping me right now? Terry. Yeah, our
Terry
good
Sullivan.
pal Terry, who's your lifelong friend. Copies of when Ernie Roth was sent out by Vince Sr. to help with Jerry Graham, get him finessed to come out in '75. So he comes out, he's already doing Grand Wizard in the Tri-WF for Vince Sr., but he comes out to LA back to doing his long time, anytime he came into Los Angeles, which was often with the Sheik from 68, 69 on, then the Blassie Cage series in 1970, which turned Fred face. So he comes out to manage Jerry Graham, get him ready. What Vince Sr. wanted to do was have a Legends tournament. I don't know if I told you this.
Yep.
But a Legends tournament with Buddy Rogers, Rocca, who was doing the co-announcing with Vince Jr., just starting at about that time, 1975. And then it would be Jerry Graham, from the glory days of Capital Sports, late 60s with Eddie Graham, the tag champs for Vince Sr. And so we're shooting, all of us are shooting. That was one of those summers I spent the whole summer in New York, and we went to every single card we could to shoot. So we're at TV, Hamburger, Allentown. Jerry Graham has 3 squatches with Ernie managing him, but they had done that in LA for months, where Ernie, his main job was to get Jerry off the sauce and to drop weight to make it for this tournament and all these high hopes. And Jerry was excited. He dropped all this weight. He was sober. And Vince just didn't care. He dropped the whole idea after he saw Jerry in those 3 squash matches. It never happened for Jerry. He then got heavy, got back on the sauce. But he was so looking forward to, like his payday, his bone was coming, and it just didn't pan out. But, and what a nice guy. I bet you got to have some great stories, because Ernie Roth offered myself, John Arisi, and I think one other guy, Dave Lupayton, we're all WFA board members by that point, in '75, a lift from New York to Boston. Roth, a genius, brain mind, sort of Paul Heyman-esque, but also an amazing talent for decades, many characters. You got to have a zillion and one Ernie Roth stories.
Oh, yeah. I've known Ernie. Oh, man. I think the first time I met him was 1966 at one of the fan conventions. And, he was just wonderful to me. Took me in, called me, one of his boys, and, I was always gracious at, letting me take pictures and stuff, and always autographs, and always willing to talk. And all through the years, he even mentored me when I told him I wanted to become a manager, mainly because his job was to talk. He was a little heat magnet outside the ring, but his main function for, like, especially the Sheik, was just talking and doing all the promos. And that's what he taught me, the art of the promo, what to say, how to say it, how to get, the fans' goat, just come up with the most outrageous ideas that you could think of to get fans to pay their money to come and see you. He was a great guy, just wonderful. And, to me, is the greatest, I'll say the greatest manager of all time when it comes to promos.
Yep.
Bobby Heenan, the greatest manager when it comes to bumps and stuff. So those two are, the top of, they're at the mountaintop. The Bobby Heenan and Ernie Roth, just the greatest of all time.
When Heenan came in, he was still, with Vern in St. Louis for Munchnick, but Heenan came in for some kind of photo shoot one time only in like 73 New York that Stan Weston and the quote unquote, we never called them After Mags, they were Stanley Weston mags. But they had that little photo shoot. I forget if that was like some goof thing they were saying, well, he was signing over to maybe Albano, Blackjack Mulligan to manage or something like that. But I don't know if Ernie and Heenan, because they were working for rival promotions, particularly during the amazing Detroit Territory War with Sheik and Bruiser, did they have any meetings or anything together or trade notes? Because they were, from different generations. Heenan much later than Ernie, who was, did so many things like well before, like, I don't even know when he started, what, 55 in Ohio as in wrestling, way before Heenan.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, probably in the late 50s when he was a number of different characters. He was the first Mr. Clean, couple other ones that are not coming to mind.
Jay Wellington Radcliffe or something.
Yeah,
he had some crazy
there's
gimmicks.
another one. Yeah, and then Heenan started, I think it was 1964 or 1965 when he was managing Chris Markoff and Angelo Poffo for Bruiser. And, before that, it's, not known worldwide, but, Heenan as a young teenager worked for Bruiser selling, Cokes, taking the ring gear back to the dressing room, selling popcorn, do whatever he could. Also, when the Sheik would come into the Bruiser, WWA at the time, this was before the promotional war. The Sheik would give Bobby Heenan his keys and said, hey, go wash my car, or before I leave, go warm my car up for me. And he'd always slip, Bobby like $5 or $10 to do that. And Heenan never forgot him for that. But as far as Heenan and Ernie, being together, I don't think they ever were together, managing wise on a show.
No, I meant behind the scenes. I meant, backstage, in the locker room or somewhere.
That did happen because when Ernie Abdullah Farouk was managing the Sheik here in Detroit, Bobby Heenan came in for a one-off shot wrestling, not managing. And that shocked the heck out of me that he even came. And I forgot who he went against. He did a job for somebody, but probably back in the dressing room, I'm sure they met and talked.
Because by that point, he, I'm talking about when Bruiser, it folded, and then he and Art Thomas and Heenan came over to do some of the joint stuff before they went on to, what was it, 3 matches, just Bruiser Sheik singles, but they had the famous tag thing. I think it was Heenan and Sheik against Bruiser and Art Thomas, but Creechman was already in Detroit at that point, and I don't think Ernie was on those shows. And then the weird thing was he did occasional one-off appearances in Detroit and Toronto, I think, as Abdullah Farouk, while he was already ensconced in the Grand Wizard gimmick for Vince Sr. And, of course, Ernie in L.A., which was, just so totally amazing. All right, I will shut up.
Well, no, the Sheik brought him in when they were doing the filming on I Like to Hurt People.
So he came back for cassette. What year did they do the pre pro footage of that thing?
76, 77.
So he was long gone from Detroit, though. Ernie was, but he
Yep.
came back for that.
He came back for that, and he managed the Sheik at one point. And then there's the classic thing in the movie, I Like to Hurt People, where Terry Sullivan is interviewing Ernie and Creechman, and they get into a shouting match back and forth, and it's one of the greatest pieces of footage of, promoism I've ever seen.
Yeah, we marked out when we saw that it was at a theatrical before I got a copy of it. The place went nuts. It had the greatest pop I've ever been to in a theater with, I guess I would call it Marx, second only to the scene where the Three Stooges pop up in It's a Mad, Mad, Mad World. We went to the Grauman's premiere of that thing. And when the Stooges came up out of nowhere, and I guess people hadn't read the credits because they rolled by so fast at the beginning, they had no idea. They see the Three Stooges, and man, that place popped like a mofo for the Three Stooges, standing ovations. It was huge.
Yeah.
Same type of pop. All right, I'll shut up, you guys. You guys have a great rest of the show.
Thank you,
Good to
Mike.
see you, Mike.
Thank you, guys.
Mike, I'll call you when we're done.
Okie doke.
So, since Bobby Heenan was brought up, Dave, I was thinking about something or two things he said. Bobby had one of the greatest quotes I ever heard when it came to managing was, you wrestle like a manager and you manage like you're a wrestler.
Yep.
And the name Chris Markoff came up there. And when the interview I heard Bobby talk about and Chris's name came up, he goes, when I think of Chris, it's watch the other kick, because Chris would like to bat you in the groin from time to time. Yeah, with that sick sense of humor.
Uh-huh.
But,
yeah. Markoff came, into Detroit in, I think it was 1974 for the Sheik and Big Time Wrestling. Only lasted a couple months. He was like a shell of himself by that point. His career was winding down. But, I marked out, because just the name, Chris Markoff, he's here. It's like, reading his, stuff in all the magazines and stuff. And, he was like a giant of the industry for many years. So when he came, I was happy as heck, and I couldn't wait to take photographs of him and stuff. And he was sort of a reserved guy, though, very quiet in the dressing room and not, loud, boisterous, anything. So I really didn't get to know him that well.
Well, Mike brought up about doing a book and photographs and stuff like that. I'm curious to know, because I happen to have it in my hand. The Brian Solomon book of the Sheik.
Yep.
ECW Press, great read. Check it out if you get a chance, folks. Was any of your pictures by chance used for this book?
Oh, almost, I think 95% were my photographs in there. Yeah, Brian contacted me before he even started writing it, asked if I'd come on board and, be interviewed for it and, tell stories. And, then it came, time for him to be putting stuff together. And it's like I, offered up, many of my photographs for it. And, they're in the book. And, it's always, that to me, it's the greatest wrestling book ever written. Everybody has their favorites, of course. But, to me, this was so well written, so well researched. There's not a, ton of BS in there, because a lot of times guys who do their own books, a lot of tales, the stretching the truth. There was no stretching the truth in this book at all. And you really learned about the man and, the way that, going back to his parents and grandparents, where they were, where they came from in Lansing, Michigan, and, how the Sheik, was a teenager and, how he got in trouble and how he went into the army before he was even, of legal age, and just goes through his whole wrestling career and all the way up to his death. Fantastic book. If a wrestling fan hasn't got this book, just forget it. You don't care about wrestling history at all.
And it's funny because me and Mike actually I just released it as we were getting on here. We went like an hour and a half, which is not a surprise, with Les Thatcher out of Ohio. And Cincinnati born and bred. Most people know he spent most of his time in the Southeast and such. But he's one of the last surviving guys, I guess, next to Gerald Briscoe, for guys who had in-ring career that still have their marbles about them and able to tell their stories and such.
Oh, Les is a great guy. He was a great talent. He was a great announcer too. He doesn't get enough credit for that. But a great teacher also, to the young kids, showing them the right way to do things. Wonderful guy, still to this day.
I always get a smile on my face when I see the email or text or whatever from and it says Les Thatcher. It says a lot about that guy, because I'm usually a miserable, salty bastard for the young age of 40. But whenever Les's name comes up, whether, like I said, it's a phone call, a text, or whatever, coming from him, it perks me up because he's just that good of a guy.
Hey, if I can go back for 1 second,
Please.
to our trading cards. Big time wrestling. It's big time wrestling trading cards is what it is, and it's like all the old guys who worked the Detroit territory, and it's limitless of my photographs of the cards that are going to be coming out. So right now they're free, and even to your listeners, if you go to Throwdown Theatre on Facebook, leave us your name and address, and we'll send you, the first set of cards. Right now we have, like you said, the Sheik, Bobo, Furpo, Dick the Bruiser. And this Sunday at a show in Detroit here that we're doing, we're passing out the 5th card in the series, and that's Terry Funk. So everybody that comes to the show gets a free card. And anybody that, sends us your, name and address, we'll mail you the first set of cards for free. And I mean, free, no strings attached.
Yes.
And what we're going to do is give out the first 10 cards for free. And then from there on, we're going to have all the other, superstars of big time wrestling, and we're going to be selling them in packs. So they'll be random, you never know what you're going to get in the pack, almost like, set of baseball cards. You never know what you're going to get. But they're going to be, they're wonderful. They're great quality. The photographs on them, the stats on the back. If you want free cards, get the first set. I can't reveal the next 5, but the first 10 cards we're going to be giving away for free. So any wrestling fan, here, go to Throwdown Theatre on your Facebook page. You can also go to throwdowntheater.com and, look at our shirts and other merch. And it's Throwdown, and the theater is spelled Theatre right now. And once we get our other website going, it'll be the American version of theater, Theater. So either way, you'll be able to get to the site. And like I said, leave us your name and address, and we'll mail you a set of cards for free.
And since we're on that, and we'll go back to the history lesson in a second, I do want to mention it, and I'm not one to blow smoke. That's not my bag. It's probably cost me a lot of money in sponsorships and all that stuff. I'm not an ass kisser. Dave knows this. We've dealt with each other for a few years.
The other night she told me you can kiss my ass. Could have made my move. She changed her mind.
Yep.
But as far as the quality of it, and I got these as far as doing a screenshot of subscribing to the YouTube channel as well. And once Dave told me this program was up and running, And I think many fans who listen know I'm also a collector. And I got binders of cards here, stuff in the boxes in the garage, and they're all over the place here at my house. And when he says they are of good quality, he's not lying. And I'm not going to sit here as a shill because I'm not. But these are high quality products.
Thanks to a shipping error, I am now currently overstocked on wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube men, and I am passing the savings on to you!
And you actually mentioned to me the other day when I asked you about doing this taping about Terry Funk. Now I was giddier than it because Terry was one of my guys that I always enjoyed and liked. Speaking of Terry, before I ask the question, and I'm sure you know him, out of Buffalo, Mr. Brian Young, the historian as well.
Mm-hmm.
He could not be here. He sends his regards. When I said, hey, do you want to pop in when I talk to Dave? He goes, I can't. It's a busy week. But Dave is one of my heroes. And coming from Brian, I know that means a lot. So.
Oh, I thank you, Brian. Much appreciated.
Yeah, which I obviously have learned, why wouldn't Dave be one of your heroes, even though he's Supermouth? But Terry Funk, I know you got to have a couple good Terry Funk stories.
Well, I first saw Terry Funk in St. Louis, 1969, when I got to be good friends with Sam Muchnick, and as a 15-year-old kid, he didn't allow anybody up at the ring in Kiel Auditorium to photograph. It just wasn't allowed. But he allowed me up there, and I would come to St. Louis 3-4 times, sometimes 5 times a year as a kid, and stay with Don Wilson, and we did the stuff with the WFIA and all. But Sam would let me go up to the ring, shoot ringside, and that's where I first saw Terry Funk. That's when he was tag teaming either with his dad, Dory Sr., or with his brother, Dory Jr. Or I seen them one time, they had a 6-man tag. So all 3 of them were in the ring at one time. And he was a young snapper back then, a great talent. And you just couldn't see back then how his career would evolve all the way from what was the Texas Chainsaw Charlie or whatever, with the nylon over his head, and then all the hardcore stuff he did years later. You couldn't have foreseen, how his career was going to go. And when me and Mike were also talking about when I was working in the office in LA, Terry came in for a few shots against Victor Rivera. That was a hot program that they did. I think Terry was going to Japan, but he did a couple shots in LA at the time. And I photographed a lot of the stuff up at the ring, in LA also. And his match against Victor Rivera, the promoter, Mike LaBelle, got in the ring, had the belt with them. And, I took pictures of all of them, together. And there was many years later at one of the CAC get-togethers, I took all the photos and I made a booklet for Terry. And, I gave it to him. Me and Mike, Leno were there. And, I gave it to Terry. And he was so happy to see them photographs and stuff. And he looked at me and he says, "Man, you look familiar, in Detroit. Do you know my uncle?" And it's like, "You mean Jack Kane?" He says, "Yeah." So we started talking about his uncle and stuff. And, he was just so happy to talk about those old days.
And it's funny. I always reference, because it's funny when I bring up Brian, I got to know Terry a little bit in the early 2000s when he was still working like independents and stuff, when he would come to Philadelphia, because I knew 1 or 2 of the promotions or the promoters quite well. So there was a couple of years I got to, and Terry was a storyteller. But, there was something about Terry that, attracted to you, but you were sitting under the learning tree. And Brian knew him closer to the end of his life because they had him on for The Wrestler's Wrestler, or interviewed him for the book, him and Dan Murphy. But him and Brian and Terry kept a great relationship. And I always love telling it. I won't tell the story here, the Roadhouse story that maybe kind of got him in trouble a little bit in Hollywood. Shocker. But I'm sure you know that story.
Yes, I do.
Uh, Let's just say I know one went on the record of saying about that story because I know people from the Roadhouse film, and two wink and a nod. One, or I should say, two out of three confirmed it with a wink and a nod, and the other one absolutely. She said, I wasn't in the room, so I can't tell you." So
Well,
we'll leave that at that.
well,
But
I think, Terry Funk would be a great subject for, in the future of one of the Dark Side of the Ring.
oh,
You know, just different things of his career and the things he did, and I mean, I could tell. I can't tell this story about Terry Funk either. Just like the Roadhouse one, but this one
oh, I've
had
told
to.
it, but it's like But go ahead.
No, there was one where Terry was in St. Louis, and we I just can't say.
Yeah, yeah. We.
I'll just say this. I'll just say this, just because both him and his wife have both passed now. That his wife caught him in a bed in a room with some arena rat, and when she walked into the room, Terry starts flopping all over the place and convinced her that this gal drugged him. So just his acting, he got out of it. I hate to tell stories like that about the guys with arena rats and stuff, but most of them I'll say we all have.
Yeah. Well, let's. Yeah. I'll put it this way, and at least the little bit I got to know Terry, and this ain't disparaging. I'll say this: any story I've heard, past or present, or what was in his book, I absolutely believe. I'll leave it like that. That's like, yeah, I can see that. That's legit.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think he would be a great subject for one of the Dark Side of the Ring episodes. But you probably know that the Sheik, they're going to have an episode on him in the upcoming weeks on Dark Side of the Ring.
Yes, that should be interesting.
Yeah,
Speaking of Dark Side of the Ring, you mentioned a name when we were talking about Handsome Hartford Love, and that being Chris Colt, who was a subject of Dark Side of the Ring.
Yep.
And I've dealt with those guys from Dark Side of the Ring, and I thought them, at least with me, I only like to speak of people that I've dealt with, or speak on people I've dealt with, and I thought they were complete gentlemen, those guys. But I'm curious to know, because you had come across Chris Colt throughout the years and stuff, and Chris is no longer with us. But how would you say, there's rumors, I should say, when it comes to episodes of Dark Side. It can be give or take. How would you say the presentation of Chris's story being told on Dark Side went?
It was pretty good. They left out so much, of his they never mentioned, the Hells Angels thing. It probably was very brief.
I think it was just a hiccup.
Yeah, because with, Ronnie Dupree, they were lovers, of course, so they touched on that a little bit, but they really never got into his wrestling career, the things that really made him. They really dealt on the gay thing, the drug thing, and but that's what Dark Side of the Ring does, But even Jim Cornette, recommended me, to have them film me because I knew him, quite well. But when we did a pre-interview and stuff, it was like, I really didn't have any dirt to dish on him. So maybe that's why they didn't, film me for that episode. But they came over my house for the Sheik episode, and oh God, they were here for a good 10 hours. And it's like when their production comes and interviews you, it was pretty amazing because they took over my entire living room, dining room, and part of my kitchen with all their equipment. It's like they were professional beyond belief. And even like the interviewer, Stu Stone, he was amazing, very respectful. And he pulled out a lot of stuff on me about the Sheik that I hadn't thought about in, eons. So, I'm looking forward to that episode.
Now, with that being said, before I move on, because I got a couple other things I want to touch on. And the reason I said about Dark Side, what I did, I thought the producers, like I said, those guys have been gentlemen whenever I speak with them, when I had them on, all that stuff. I can't say, but I've heard, and it seems like wrestling, it's like always you hear the hubbub of the negative and this, that, and the other, whether it's the dirt sheets or whatever the case may be. I've heard quotes from guys like, say, a Jim Ross who's been on many of the episodes and stuff. Some things were like the plane ride from hell and all. Oh, some things were taken out of context and this, that, and the other along that line. You said they were at your place for 10 hours and pulled stuff out that you haven't thought about and such. Are you worried about some of the stories they might use being taken out of context?
Not of anything that I've told them. I didn't dish any dirt on the Sheik at all. I was completely truthful. I told stories about, things that should never have been told, that the Sheik wouldn't have want told. Like one of them, like the day before his son's wedding, Eddie Farhad Jr., me and the Sheik were at the bridal shower. Just me and him sitting there and just talking and asking me about life and things like that. And it's like, I was so young at the time that I didn't have the foresight to ask him about his early career and stuff, especially his relationship with Leaping Larry Shane, which that's how I got started in this whole crazy world of wrestling, because Leaping Larry Shane was my upstairs neighbor at our house, and I had no idea that him and the Sheik were, very close friends. And when Larry passed away in 1964 from an unfortunate car accident, the Sheik paid for his funeral. How many people know that? So, and I had no idea that they were, friends and stuff, or I would have, hey, look, I know Larry, and the Sheik would have been, who knows?
Yeah.
But, there's no dirt that I dished at all. And some of the stuff, or some of the people that they did interview, like they interviewed his grandchildren. And it's like, I can't, what are they going to have to offer? They were like, what, 2-3 years old? How are they going to even have, something to say of note, about the Sheik back then? Yeah. It'll be an interesting episode, as they all are.
Absolutely. And, I was going back when I got back from the store, some of our previous conversations, because Dave's been on 2 other times and he was part of a 4-day charity run. So there was a lot of material to go through because we talk history all the time. Mike's usually with us most of it, and we won't get into, or I won't get into the stuff that's going on. Not my place to tell that story. But you were talking about in a previous episode with Terry Sullivan and a few other guys. I think this was the first solo one you did. And you were talking about Terry and a few other guys tried to do like a outlaw promotion kind of deal. You went and they offered you an opportunity to manage, which was something you wanted to do. And you told a story about Sheik eventually coming to you because you had rented his production truck to tape commercials.
Yep.
So, but anyway, we'll fast forward. If you want to tell that story, you can. But you also mentioned that the Sheik was training you with promos as you were getting into managing, which not many people realize that you, with leading into some of those promos that were wraparounds and different things, you used music, which wasn't really done at that time in the 70s, correct?
Yep. Exactly. Yeah, a lot of people, other people get credit, with being the first to use music, entrance music. And the very first one would have been Gorgeous George, of course.
Happy Circumstance, yeah.
Yeah, and not until I, was, a young, rock and roller and stuff like that. And I figured, what better to introduce, this music as entrance instead of just coming out of a dressing room. The only other time that I saw it, other than, I didn't see it live back, in the Gorgeous George days, I just knew about it. But the very first time, this would have been 1967, right when Batman came on TV. And then the Sheik created this Batman character, and they called him Batman. And he came out to the ring with the Batman theme song music. Well, that only lasted 2 shows because ABC contacted the Sheik, and that was, cease and desist. But then again, the Batman thing also, they did it in Pittsburgh. Bruno had Tony Marino in a Batman outfit, and he got a cease and desist. But what Tony Marino did was just add another T to the Batman. So it was Battman, and ABC couldn't do anything about it. But he couldn't use any of the music either.
Yeah.
But over the years, like you mentioned, the promos, when I was the Sheik's photographer and writing the body press program, he knew I wanted to be a manager, and he had the mobile TV truck that he owned, and that's how he would film all the promos, either at Cobo after a show or at his office up in Williamston. So he knew I wanted to be a manager, and it's like he would, at the very end, he would give me a guy, a Hank James, a Killer Brooks, or, Ben Justice. And he goes, okay, get up there, give me 2 minutes. You're going against Boom, 2 minutes, go. And I would do that. And then we'd go back in the TV truck and Sheik would say, okay, you did this right, you did this right. But, when you're talking, and he would tell me the rights and the wrongs, of what I was doing. So he groomed me, to that. But unfortunately, I worked, some shows with beautiful Ben Justice, but then that stopped because I think the main reason I didn't get an opportunity was because the Sheik and Bruiser, promotional war. And that was about to end. Sheik was buying out Bruiser. Bruiser was going to cease, running shows at the Olympia. Sheik was going to take over those dates that he already had booked, and he was going to bring in some of his guys, and then we were going to work the big Sheik Dick the Bruiser program. So I think that was more on his mind than having, a Dave Drason come in and, start managing. And then, it happened late 1974. Tony Marino, Killer Brooks, Ben Justice, Sheik's Booker, Jack Kane, Terry Sullivan, and they already had this plan that they were going to run this rival promotion, and they already had TV because Jack Kane's name was on the TV contract in Toledo. So they just took over that program right away, and the Sheik show didn't even get on in Ohio, which sort of hurt his Toledo sports arena shows. So it was, a couple months into that, and then they needed a manager. And it's like, those guys and Terry and those guys knew, I wanted to be a manager, and they brought me in and they gave me the opportunity. And I thank them to this day for, launching my career and letting me, learn and work my craft. And, I got to work with, some of my friends, Hartford Love and Eric the Red and Ben Justice. And, finally over the years, I got to manage the Sheik. It's like, what a crazy career.
Yeah, and I found that funny that the Sheik was training you behind the scenes for promos and such as things evolved because Sheik wasn't really one of those guys known for talking, but obviously one of the smartest guys in the business. But
yep,
you mentioned earlier about doing the shows for Rox TV, and that's part of Throwdown Theatre, folks. Which check out the links provided on this episode to get your trading cards, all that fun stuff. But when did you notice that Big Time Wrestling was kind of folding as under the Sheik's version of that?
Early 1975. Well, right about the time when, we did the rival promotion. And then, once that stopped, we did that for like a year and a half. And then George Cannon took it over, and that became Superstars of Wrestling. Tony Marino, was welcomed back into the fold. He came back as a heel, though. Ben Justice came back, a couple years later for one shot, and then he just, quit. Killer Brooks, came back for one or two shots in like the very late 1970s. And then cards were dwindling. There was a recession happening in Detroit. People had, better use for their money than going to see big time wrestling. At the time, the Detroit Tigers sucked, so nobody was going to those ball games. As always, the Detroit Lions sucked since the 1950s. The Detroit Pistons, they weren't going anywhere. So people, started, using their hard-earned dollars, to do other things than, attend sporting events. So by the end of, let's see, it would have been October 3rd, I think, of 1980 that the Sheik held his last show at Cobo Arena. He owed, a lot of money to them that he couldn't pay. He had already lost his TV truck. He was losing his mansion in, Williamston. He started running, spot shows in like Wyandotte, Michigan, and, just the big time wrestling name, he couldn't afford the talent and stuff. Also, the WWF at the time was coming on and buying out territories and buying up all the talent. And, anybody that was a wrestling fans, now they can watch it on TV 2-3 times a week, as opposed to big time wrestling that was, garnered to a, VHF station here that didn't even reach the outskirts, the suburbs. The signal didn't reach them, so nobody knew, when any wrestling was happening around, for big time wrestling.
So you mean there wasn't people like you would see on Married with Children hanging with antennas and the what do you call it, the stuff you would cook with, the styrofoam and things?
Yeah, well, if you were lucky, if you were a suburbanite that had a big antenna, you might be able to pick up that channel. But yeah, the signal was so weak, it didn't even hit the outskirts, 8 miles away. It was just, bad times for the, wrestling in Detroit at the time.
You mentioned about not being able to pay talent and all, but there was how would you say managers' money was at the time? Because obviously I've heard Bobby Heenan tell his stories as far as like if he was managing main event talent, he'd get main event money, etc. But with your experience, were managers paid fairly, and how would you justify? Because I'm always curious, and I don't want to know exact numbers and stuff. That's not my business. But how would managers justify, oh, I think I'm worth X. Let's say a wrestling talent is getting $500 for
Yep.
a match, whatever. But how do you justify to managers? Hey, I think I'm worth at least X.
Well, I'll put it this way. Very few managers made a lot of money. You know, you may have, even Bobby Heenan, he didn't make a lot of money managing. That's why he got into wrestling. You know, when he wrestled, he got wrestler money. When he managed, he got maybe a third of that, you know, or maybe even less. And when I would talk to Jim Cornette about this, what was the tag team that he had? Midnight Express. They fought, you know, they said to the promoters, Jim makes the same money we do, or we're not here. So Jim told me that. So, and you have to look at managers all across all the territories back then. You know, you had, you know, guys, let me think of, besides, you know, Arnold Skolin in New York, well, he was one of the office guys, so he made his money. But
he was going to get factored in.
But you take guys like, give me some obscure ones. Homer Odell, you know, didn't make any money at all. You know, he had to wrestle to make any kind of money. There was, you know, some other guys down south just couldn't make it. You know, and even myself, you know, I had to get a regular job to support myself because, you know, just say, you know, managing, when I was managing the Kangaroos or managing Malcolm Monroe, even managing the Sheik, you know, I was lucky to get $50 to $100. You know, some of the promoters, you know, would say, hey, you know, just the manager here, you know, Supermouth here, he's worth the price of admission, you know, and, you know, I gave the fans like the biggest pop of the night, but, you know, and taking all the bumps and stuff like that, it's like, man, I just didn't make that much money at all. There was a couple promoters here and there that took care of me. I'll say one was Jim Lancaster. When I came in and worked for him, he was very nice, paid me well. Malcolm Monroe paid me well. Ricky Cortez paid me well. But Al Costello, his shows, it's like, you know, strictly, you know, $50 if I was lucky. Even when I went down and worked for a couple of shows in the South for, can't think of the promoter right offhand, but, you know, $25, sometimes $15, you know, it didn't even pay for your hotel, your gas, your food, you know, but that was the life of a wrestling manager back then. You know, nowadays, you know, you got, well, basically Heyman's the only manager that I can think of, and I'm sure he's paid handsomely. Even prior when, you know, Vince got rid of all the managers like the Jimmy Harts and the Lou Albanos and stuff like that, and he started bringing in the, you know, TNA kind of, you know, gals who had no talent at all, but they were eye candy for the young kids, you know, watching TV. You know, and they weren't managers. You know, they were eye candy. They didn't know anything about wrestling.
And you couldn't get your payoff. Where, like, say, a Bobby Heenan, for example, where he'd piss you the hell off, and, you know, whether you're working with Bundy or John Studd or go down the list of Andre, where eventually you would get your hands on or Bobby. Like, I always think, or one that stands out to me right now because I just mentioned it, the Bundy cage match with Hogan. After the match, Hogan got a hold of him, throw him across the cage, you know, he flip flop and fly, and I mean, you could get your comeuppance on the manager, where with female talent you couldn't do that.
Exactly. You know, and you know, sometimes, you know, it took one of the other gal valets to take a bra off the other valet, you know, to, you know, generate some, you know, teenage angst there, you know, get their kicks off of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't managers. They, you know, the managers of the old territory days and stuff is a dying breed. It's a dead breed.
Yeah.
It's never going to come back. We were characters, and we were extra added attractions, that we brought excitement to the shows. We, went on TV and did the promos to get the fans in the seats, but underpaid, underappreciated, I thought.
Yeah. 2 more questions for you, sir, and I appreciate the time. One wrestling related, and you brought this up before several years ago, but I can't remember exactly what it is. And it's not the whiskey, folks. No. You brought up you had a item from Andy Kaufman, and I believe he signed it. What was that?
Yep. The neck brace when Jerry Lawler did the pile driver on him. They did the episode on, I forgot the WWE show when they go out looking for stuff. And
Most Valuable Treasures, one of those, yeah.
Yeah. And they were looking for that neck brace that Kaufman wore on Letterman and stuff like that. And Bill Apter happened to have one. And, he sold it to him. And I even asked Bill, is that the original? He says, well, I can't be sure, and I can't be sure mine is either, but I have one of the neck braces, signed by Andy Kaufman.
Well, how did you come across yours? Because obviously I know Bill's story, and God bless Bill. I haven't had him on. He's one of those guys I'd like to eventually, I'll make that happen. But I know the connection because obviously Bill gave Kaufman Jerry Lawler's number and, obviously made that connection. So I know how Bill could obviously come across that. But how did you come across your neck brace?
When we were at a WFIA convention in Memphis, Tennessee, and Jerry Lawler was very nice to us and, provided us with everything, had all the guys come to our banquet and stuff. And we even had a charity baseball game where my team of myself and Don Wilson and Greg Masoriak and Steve Johnson and Tom Burke and Eddie Gilbert even played on my team. And we went against Jerry Lawler's regular baseball team. So we had a charity game with that. And then the next day, Jerry had me go out with a trophy to give to somebody. I can't even remember who the trophy was going to. And then the mass tag team, came out and said, hey, we should get it. And, they punched me around and I took a couple bumps on the set. And, they took the trophy and, threw it away. But then we were in the back room in the dressing room at the TV studio and Andy Kaufman was there. And we got to talking about managing and the Sheik and Freddie Blassie and things like that. And it's like he had already done the, neck gimmick with Lawler. So he was wearing that. And, we were leaving the studio and he took it off and signed it for me. And, he was very gracious.
Nice. Well, you are, I notice, because not many people I would say I've let into my circle. But I'm proud to say Dave is one of those guys that I will talk to about both personal show stuff, all aspects, because I trust Dave's brain and he hasn't steered me wrong. So I can say that Dave has become a friend, folks. But I'm curious to know, because I know we've had this conversation, I think, a little bit before, both on and off. But you are currently having a glass of wine. What would you are known for drinking wine and having a cocktail once in a great while. So what would you say your favorite wine is currently?
Well, first and foremost, that's all I drink is wine, besides water and, a soda here and there. But I never drink.
We're not alcoholics, folks.
No. Never hard alcohol, not even a beer. I can't stand it. But wine, it's like, I'm a certified sommelier, which means an expert in wine. Um, I have so many favorites. Really a Pinot Noir nut. I think, I'd say more than 60% of my wine cellar, which I think I'm hovering between 1,400 and 1,500 bottles in my cellar. And most of them are Pinot Noir. I'll say 60%. But I love it all. I love Pinot Noir. I love Syrah. I love Petit Syrah. I love Zinfandel. I love Rosé. I love Viognier. I love, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. There's just, it's hard for me to pin down, a favorite. On a daily basis, I prefer Pinot Noir. But favorite of all time, I'd have to say that, I've been fortunate to drink, stuff from the 20s and 30s and 40s and all these great wines. But one that sticks in my mind is a 1989 Chateau Margaux, first growth French wine. Just fabulous. That's one that sticks in my mind.
And I stick with the Irish whiskey, and people know I drink Tullamore, which came out in 1829, something like that. But the way you just answered that makes me curious, because I've heard this, and I've never drank in wine. So does that actually matter as far as some years, depending on what you have?
Oh, of course. That's the one thing a lot of wine drinking people don't understand, because wine is grown almost, the grapes grow, and it's never the exact same temperatures and weather, of great years, like temperature flows, hot, cold. Sometimes, like right now, where there's budding, the budding happens. And if you get, over excesses of rain or sleet or something like that damages those buds, well, those vines just ain't going to grow, or they're going to be, bad. So there's just so much that goes, and a lot of people think that, okay, the grapes grow, you pick the grapes, you crush the grapes, you put it in the bottle, that's it. Well, that's far from the truth. That's like a microcosm of what really happens before wine gets in the bottle. The grapes have to grow. The winemakers, they go out in the fields and they look and test the grapes as they're growing and look for mold and trim leaves to get sunshine in there. And then once the grapes are almost ready for picking, now it's almost a science to watch winemakers, test for sugars, sugar level in the wine, and, acidity and so many other things. And there's just so much that goes on before it gets in the bottle. And it's like, I could spend another, 2, 3, 4 hours discussing it. But, I just love to, have a glass of wine with a good dinner. And I had lunch with a good friend today that we went to Capitol Grill and had Wagyu beef burgers, with 2 glasses of wine. And it was, we had great conversation, and was a great day. And it's even a greater day to sit here and talk to you.
I appreciate that. And that's the way I look at it, is I enjoy sipping on some whiskey, having good conversation about the history, and not just history, but old school wrestling and all that stuff. But as we put a bow on this, Dave, and thank you for the time, I want to mention.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always great to talk to you, and I appreciate your respectfulness and the questions that you ask. And I hope your fan base that listens to this enjoys what we have to talk about.
I shouldn't say I'm surprised, but I can tell you the fan base has been eating it up. But as we put a bow on this, I do want to mention again, Throwdown Theatre. They talk classic wrestling, rare matches, deep dives into some of the legends of the business. They have the trading cards, as we mentioned, big time memories, the highlights, and wrestling real talk. but they also have exclusive content and lost footage that Dave was mentioning earlier. That, and you know what? I'll wrap with this. You mentioned about some people earlier making a conversion for you. It's some of the old footage that you had and other people had. Was that 8mm? Do you remember what was being converted to be digitalized?
Oh, VHS tapes.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the thing that I've always wanted is, like, you know, the so many shows that I did for George Cannon Superstars, Johnny Powers had all those tapes, and those were on 2-inch tapes. And he offered to sell me those tapes. I guess he had like, well over 200 tapes of these, 2-inch cassettes. But, to buy them, I mean, try to find any kind of TV studio or recording place that has a 2-inch tape machine anymore to convert them. It would have cost a fortune. So that's why I didn't buy the tapes.
But anyway, folks, go to Throwdown Theater. The links we provided, the YouTube, the Facebook, the Instagram. Reach out, show you subscribe. They'll get you the trading cards. And like Dave said, they're going to do it up to 10 cards. Then you're going to be able to buy it as packs, random, all that fun stuff. But Supermouth, Dave, thank you so much for the time.
Jonathan, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, wrestling fans.
Hi, this is Terry Sullivan, big-time wrestling announcer from the 70s, and you are listening to Crazy Train Radio.